Hello, hello. Welcome back. We are going to start tonight with some thank yous to the magic makers of this festival. And so I want to call out first Lucy Lee, our SCAD intern. Just stand up there. Joyce Barnard, our program coordinator. Mickey McNamara, our assistant director. And truly, someone we are all so grateful for, Tara Setter, our executive director. And then, if all four of you can stand there together, and can somebody take a picture for us? And then we're on with the program. All right, thank you so much.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Ivy Council. I'm a member of the Savannah Book Festival's Executive Committee. After 3 days, I've got some friends in the audience when you hear that whoop. They're like, we're gonna cheer for you, Ivy. After 3 days of celeb rating books and writers, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the grand finale of our festival weekend. This year's festival has been a resounding success, and we're deeply grateful for the support in promoting reading, writing, and civil conversation. This cherished event wouldn't be possible without the very generous contributions of our chairperson's circle sponsors, the Beekman family, David and Nancy Cintron, Bob Faircloth, the Courtney Knight Gaines Foundation, Doctors Mickey and Kristen Ott, the Gerald D. and Helen M. Stevens Foundation, Robert and Linda Zerby, and an investment from the City of Savannah. A special thank you goes to the sponsor of today's closing address, Mrs. Mara Sovjan. On behalf of my fellow board members and 200 plus volunteers who make this festival a reality, I am thrilled to welcome you to an afternoon with the extraordinary Ben Mezrich. Woo-hoo. We're fortunate to have a dedicated group of volunteers serving as your ushers today. Please join me in giving a round of applause for members of the Second Thursday Book Club, the Peacock Guild Book Club, the Best Little Book Club, and the Downtown Debut Book Club. A few quick housekeeping notes. If you haven't done so already, please silence your phones. There's no flash photography. Please keep that in mind. And during the Q&A session, we want to hear your questions, so raise your hand if you have one, and a volunteer will bring you a microphone. However, please limit your question to just one. After the presentation, Ben Mezrich will sign festival purchase books. Make sure to have your numbered signing card ready to secure your place in line. Today, we are thrilled to be joined by one of the most dynamic and engaging storytellers of our time, a writer whose books have captured the imaginations of millions of readers worldwide. Ben Mezrich is an author whose work blends the pulse-pounding energy of true crime, the intrigue of financial and technological innovation, and the thrills of human ambition. His ability to take real-life events and transform them into gripping narratives is unparalleled. And his stories, they resonate for not only their drama and excitement, but for their complex and often hidden forces that drive them. Ben's breakout book, Bringing Down the House, introduced us to the thrilling true story of MIT students who mastered high-stakes gambling. It became a bestseller and inspired the hit movie 21. With The Accidental Billionaires, Ben turned his lens on Facebook's dramatic origins, a story later adapted into the Academy Award-winning film The Social Network. In recent works like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and The Back Channel, Ben delves into technology, entertainment, and global politics, offering an insider's view of high-profile events. His work transcends genres, blending elements of memoirs and biography and investigative journalism with an energy and a narrative style of a thriller. Tonight, Ben joins us with his latest work, The Mistress and the Key. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the one and only Ben Mezrich.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for having me to your incredible city. This place is just staggeringly beautiful. This theater is incredible. But this morning my wife was like, we should just move here. It's so incredible. And obviously it certainly helps that we came in from Boston where it is snowing and it is incredible here today. So thank you for being inside on a beautiful day and for appreciating books, because we're in a time period where books are, something so important right now. I think there's nothing more important than getting people to read more, and it's incredible to see so many people supporting that. So I am the author now of 28 books, right, which sounds like a lot. Thank you. It sounds like a lot, but people only really read like 2 of them. But I have written 28 books at this point. I'm most well known, I think, for my movies at this point. 21 about the MIT Blackjack team, The Social Network about Zuckerberg and the founding of Facebook, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen, and then Dumb Money was out last year about the GameStop drama, if any of you saw that, and I also write and produce for the show Billions, if any of you watch that show. Thank you. So I've definitely known a bit more for my Hollywood stuff than for my books recently, and my story that I want to tell you today is about how I got here and how I got to this point in my career, how my books happened, how I became a writer, and then, onto the latest stuff. Because I never really set out to be a nonfiction writer, even though it's what I became known for. As a kid, I hated nonfiction. I loved TV. I loved really bad TV, like Saved by the Bell and Three's Company. I know I'm dating myself. Some of you younger people don't know those shows, but I really loved those shows. But my parents, fearing the worst, set a rule when we were little that we had to read 2 books every week before we were allowed to watch TV. So beginning very early in my life, and this was about the age of 10 or 11, I became a speed reader because I wanted to watch Three's Company, not for the right reasons at all. And by the time I got to college, I realized I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know what that meant, but that's what I wanted to be. So after college, I locked myself in an apartment because my dad said, you want to be a writer? What are you going to do for a living? And I said, I'm going to be a writer. And he said, I'll give you 1 year, right? I won't let you starve for 1 year, but you got to show some progress. So I locked myself in an apartment in Boston, and I wrote 9 novels in a year. I don't recommend that to any of you. I'm sure some of you are writers. Please don't try and write 9 novels in a year. It's not fun or healthy. I was writing 40 pages a day for a year. And then I would send them out, and they would get rejected and rejected and rejected. I was writing deep, dark stories that took place in bars in New York City because I was reading Jay McInerney and Bret Easton Ellis, the great 80s writers, which was the wrong thing to be reading at that time in my life because you can't just be Jay McInerney and write Bright Lakes Big City. But I kept trying and I kept trying. And I was rejected by everyone. I got 190 rejection slips by the end of that year. I had them taped to my walls like a serial killer. I would sit in the middle of all of this rejection. But I was good with rejection. I'm a pretty nerdy guy. In high school, I don't think I ever caught a ball thrown in my general direction. So I was rejected a lot in high school, so I was used to it. But I was sitting in this room full of rejection. And finally, an editor took pity on me, called me up, met me in New York, and he said, I'm not going to publish any of the crap you've been writing. But go read John Grisham, go read Michael Crichton, go read Robert Ludlum. Try and write like that. So I went back to Boston, and I got a stack of Michael Crichton and John Grisham and Robert Ludlum, and I read them, and I was like, all right, I'm going to try and write a thriller. So my dad is a doctor, and so I decided I will write a medical thriller. So I wrote a book called Threshold. Don't worry, none of you have ever heard of it, because it sold 6 copies. 3 of them were to my mom. And it was about an evil scientist who implants genetic diseases in people, so people are dying from weird genetic diseases. So it was my first book. It led to a second book called Reaper. This was about a computer virus that makes the jump to the biological world, and people start getting sick from their TV sets. And I came up with this crazy idea after watching a really bad episode of Oprah. You know, it wasn't a great book, but it ended up being turned into a TV movie called Fatal Error, which is a movie I hope none of you have ever seen. It airs on the Sci-Fi Channel at like 2 in the morning. It stars Antonio Sabato Jr. Remember him, the Melrose Place actor? And he plays a surgeon, which is very believable casting. I didn't know surgeons did so many sit-ups in between their patients, and that's what Antonio was doing on set, just sit-up after sit-up. He looked great, though. And I remember watching this horrible movie with my dad, and there's a scene where Antonio is leaning over a patient's chest, and he goes, "We've got a subdural hematoma." And my dad looked at me and go, "You know that's in the head, right?" Anyways, that was the quality of the work at the time. I ended up getting a call from the X-Files television show. You guys remember the X-Files? Great show. And they wanted me to write for them. But I didn't drive at the time. I was a kid in Boston, didn't really need to drive, and I didn't want to move to LA. So I said, I'll write a book starring Mulder and Scully, which are the characters. So I wrote a thriller called Skin, about a skin transplant gone bad. And this guy gets a skin transplant from a serial killer, and then he starts killing people. It sounds so stupid, right? And so Mulder and Scully go to Thailand, where they find the skin was from this monster. And I'd never been to Thailand, so I wrote the whole book from a Fyodor's guidebook that was sitting on my desk. And that was sort of the trash I was writing, pop, sci-fi. I was not making a living. I was massively in debt. I was $2 million in debt as a 26-year-old. That's a whole other story. You don't want to get that big in debt, let's put it that way. You don't want to have an IRS agent who knows you by name. That's always a bad thing. So anyways, I was like, what am I going to do with my life? I'm a writer who can't sell books. I'm sitting at home. I had a stack of business school applications under my bed because I thought the only way I'm ever going to pay down this debt is to go to business school. And then I was hanging out in a bar, and my friend who went to college with me introduced me to this group of kids in the bar. And they were like regular nerdy kids. They were MIT kids. But what was weird is they had tons of money. And all of it was in $100 bills. Now, I don't know what it's like in Savannah. In Boston, you never see $100 bills. Certainly not back then. Nobody had a $100 bill. They didn't even take them in the cash registers. $100 bills was a lot of money. And so I wondered, why does this kid have all these $100 bills? And I went over the main character's house, and his name was Jeff. In the book, I changed his name because he didn't want to be known as the MIT kid who played blackjack. Now that there was a movie, he does want to be known as the MIT kid who played blackjack. So I do call his real name now. His name is Jeff. I went over his apartment, and he pointed to his laundry. And in his laundry was $250,000 and just stacks of hundreds. And I was like, okay, this kid's got to be a drug dealer, right? Who has $250,000 in their laundry? But he was a nice kid. He was a nerdy kid. And he says, come to Vegas with me tomorrow. And I was at a point in my life where I could just do that. So I got on a plane with him and I flew to Vegas. And 5 of his friends flew with us, but they pretended that they didn't know each other. We get to the airport, we all kind of go around, we get to a car, and there was like a waiting limo with a uniformed driver. And he's like, Mr. Kaplan, your car is here. And that wasn't even my friend's name. And we get in this car and we go to a suite. And it was the biggest suite I've ever seen. It was overlooking the Vegas Strip. It had like a waterfall in it. And all the MIT kids start coming into the room and they start pulling money out from under their clothes. And they pile it up on the table. And it was $1 million in cash. And they had flown from Boston with it under their clothes, $1 million. And they said, we're the MIT blackjack team. And so I had heard of something called the MIT blackjack team in Boston. I thought it was like a math class where they learn how to play blackjack. The reality was, this had been going on for 20 years. One team of MIT kids would teach the next team, would teach the next team. And this group of kids had made $6 million playing blackjack. And I was blown away, because here I had been writing all of this trash sci-fi and not getting anywhere. And there was this true story that was better than anything I was coming up with on my own. So I joined the MIT blackjack team. I started going to Vegas with them every weekend. I'm not a journalist. I don't know how to write journalism. I was just putting money under my clothes. We had duffel bags of cash. We're hitting these Vegas casinos. And the MIT team had a really interesting method. So some of you might be gamblers. I'll give you the short version of this. Blackjack is a beatable game. And the reason that blackjack is beatable is because the deck changes as you play. It's got a memory. Doesn't matter how many times roulette wheel spins red. Doesn't change your odds of spinning black, right? But if all the aces come out of a blackjack deck, you can't get 21. So decks do change as you go through them. So if you're sitting there and you're watching the cards, you keep track of the low cards, you keep track of the high cards. When there are more high cards in the deck, more low cards have come out, you're going to win more. Because the dealer's going to bust more often, you're going to hit blackjack more often. So that's all that card counting is. You sit there, you watch the cards, you keep track of the low cards, keep track of the high cards, you figure out when to bet more, and you raise your bet. Problem is, casinos frown upon this. It's not illegal to use your brain in a casino, but casinos would like it to be. And so essentially, if you get caught doing this, they'll throw you out, or worse. Now, the MIT team would get around this by using team method. You spread 10 kids out around a casino, 1 kid sitting at each table, and that kid is keeping track of the cards. He looks like a regular college kid. He's betting $10 a hand. When the deck gets good, you signal the guy you call the big player. Now, the big player has to look like a rich person. The big player has to look like he's drunk. The MIT team would actually fill a thermos with apple juice. And they'd show up in Vegas, they'd order a scotch, go to the bathroom, dump it out, and put apple juice in it. So they were drinking apple juice all night. You would sit down at the table and bet $10,000 a hand. Then you get the signal that it's no longer good and you keep moving. So in this way, the big money is only playing on good decks. You can win as much as 2% per hand. Doesn't sound like a lot, but over a course of a night, you could win $500,000 doing this, if you were lucky. You could win $100,000 on average a night. So the MIT team was doing this. They were also using the casino's own stereotypes against them. A casino has an idea of what a high, big roller looks like. It's not a geeky guy with glasses. If I showed up in Vegas right now with $1 million in a duffel bag, that looks really weird, because I'm not what they look like. But if an Asian person or a Persian person shows up in Vegas with $1 million in cash, it actually looks normal, because that's what most high rollers look like. So at MIT, they'd recruit as many Asians and Persians as they could. If you were at MIT, you would know that that wasn't that hard, because half the school was Asian and Persian at the time, but their team was mostly made up of Asians and Persians. They would also use the casino's own chauvinism against them. Casinos are notoriously male chauvinistic. They don't believe that women can do math. And I remember interviewing one woman on the team. She was an attractive blonde woman. She would go to the casino dressed in a tennis outfit. She would carry a tennis racket, and she would sit down at a blackjack table, and she would say, my boyfriend is still playing tennis. I'm so bored. I'm going to bet all his money. And she'd put $10,000 out on the table. And the casino thinks she's just some dumb blonde. The reality is she's applied math economics major at MIT, and she was winning hundreds of thousands of dollars doing this, which was very awesome. So the MIT team won millions doing this. They eventually got caught because a security guard, the casinos all kind of employ the same private eye, and he started to notice there was a big player winning in every casino the guy played with. So we followed the guy back to Boston, discovered the guy went to MIT, got a hold of 10 years of MIT yearbooks. and put all of the photos into the facial recognition software that all casinos use. So if any of you went to MIT in the same time period and you went to a casino and bet more than $25, an alarm would go off in the security room and they'd start to investigate you. Now, the first thing that happens if you're playing at a casino and they think you're card counting is a very big guy gets into your personal space. He leans close to you and he says, "You can't play here anymore." Now, you can't do anything. You can't touch him because that would be assault, but you haven't done anything illegal. You get up and you leave. If you come back, they try and back room you. Let me just tell you a thing. You do not ever want to go to the back room. Not just in a casino, in pretty much anywhere. The back room is not a good place to be. There's no windows in the back room. There's always a guy standing out in the hallway talking about taking a drive out into the desert. They might handcuff you in the back room. I'm just saying. I'm not saying how I know this, but I know this. And eventually, you have to prove that you are not doing anything illegal, and then they throw you out and you're done. So that is what happened to the MIT Blackjack team. They got backroomed and thrown out. So I wrote this. I thought this was a great idea. My publisher was like, nobody cares about Vegas. This was back before Vegas got hot again. And they were like, nobody cares about cards. This was back before cards got hot again. But I wrote it anyways. I wrote an article for Wired magazine. You guys know Wired magazine. And that night, the article came out. I'm sitting at home, and the phone rings. And I pick it up, and it's the actor Kevin Spacey. Now, getting a call from Kevin Spacey today would be a very different phone call. Just put that out there. My mom is like, maybe you should take this part out of your speech. But I'm just saying, Kevin Spacey called me, and at the time, he was the biggest actor in the world, right? He was a huge star. He calls me up, and he says, "I want to make this into a movie." And I was like, that sounds great. So he takes the project out. It was just a manuscript at the time. Takes that all over Hollywood, and it's turned down by everyone. Everyone rejects it, except for MGM Studios, which owned the casinos that we were hitting. And I was like, wait, do they want to make this movie or make it go away? And they told us, no, we want to make this movie because it makes people think they can beat blackjack. The reality is, to join the MIT Blackjack team, you had to practice for 6 months. They would take you to fake casinos. They would throw numbers at you. They would try and mess you up, because if you made even one mistake an hour, it was worse than not card counting at all. So they loved the movie, and I always see people reading that book or watching that movie on the flight to Vegas, and I feel so bad because they're all going to lose their money. That's the worst time to read that book. But that book changed my life. I was, very excited. The movie was about to come out. I was sitting at home. I didn't know what I was going to write next, and I got a weird email at 2 in the morning, and the email said, "My best friend founded Facebook, and no one's ever heard of him." Now, I'd heard of a guy named Mark Zuckerberg, never heard of anybody else. This was 2007, so Facebook was very small at the time. But I was interested, so I went out for a drink in a bar. Everything good happens in my life in a bar. I should spend more time in bars. I'm sitting in the bar, and in walks Eduardo Saverin. And some of you have seen the movie The Social Network. Andrew Garfield plays him in the movie. Eduardo looks a little like Andrew. He's kind of like Andrew, but like who's been kicked a couple times. Like, not quite. And that's what Hollywood does, right? That 21 movie is the best looking group of MIT kids you've ever seen in your life. Social Network is similar. Eduardo walks in, he sits down, and he starts the conversation by saying, "Mark Zuckerberg screwed me." And I was like, tell me more. And he was probably the first person to be able to say that. I think since then a lot of people have been able to say that. But he was the first person to be screwed by Mark Zuckerberg. He basically told me this crazy story about 2 best friends who met in an underground fraternity. They were not good at meeting girls. They were not cool. They wanted to be members of one of the finals clubs, which are the semi-secret all-boys things at Harvard that go back hundreds of years. But they couldn't get in. Eduardo eventually did get in, and Mark didn't. When Mark didn't, he went on a date with this girl. The date didn't go well. He went back to his dorm room, got drunk, and then hacked all the computers at Harvard. And he made a website where you could vote on who the hottest girl at Harvard was. And he basically wanted to compare the girls to farm animals, which shows you his social maturity at the time. But he ended up putting this website out. It leaked to all of his friends, and it crashed Harvard's computer servers in one night. 20,000 people tried to log in at the same time. That night, he caught the attention of the Winklevi twins. You could not invent these guys if you wanted to, right? 6'5", identical twin Olympic rowers, the cool kids on campus, members of the Porcellian, which is the ultimate finals club. They say at the Porcellian, if you haven't made your first million by the age of 30, they give you $1 million. I don't think that's true, but that's what they say. I remember my wife and I met the Winklevi for the first time in a hotel room in New York, and they walk in, they're like Greek gods. They look exactly the same. They eat like monsters. They eat so much food. They walked in, and I was like, they look like the bad guys in every 80s movie. They look like the guys in the skeleton costume chasing the Karate Kid around the gym. I ended up putting that in the book. Aaron Sorkin put that in the movie. And when the movie came out, Ralph Macchio called me, and he was like, I love that you're talking about the Karate Kid in the Social Network. Anyways, the Winklevi see this Mark Zuckerberg in the newspaper because he was almost getting kicked out of school for that website he made. And they said, oh, we need a guy, because they were working on their own website called the HarvardConnection.com. The Harvard Connection was a website, it was a dating site to help women meet Harvard men. That's what Harvard guys do. You sit in your room all day trying to figure out how to help women meet you. This was their plan. So they didn't know how to code. They were not computer guys. So they needed what they called a nerd. They hired Mark Zuckerberg. Now, Zuckerberg didn't think much of them, but he liked the idea of hanging out with the cool kids on campus. So he said yes, and then he blew them off. Instead, he went to his buddy Eduardo, and he said, Eduardo, you have a little money. Eduardo's family was wealthy. I have an idea for a website. Girls will put their own pictures up. We won't get in trouble, and it'll become a site where you can meet people. It'll be a friend site. Eduardo thinks this is a fine idea, and he gives him $1,000. Greatest investment in the history of the world. Mark says to him, you can be CFO, you get 30% of the company, I'll keep 70% of the company. There's no lawyers, just two guys in a dorm room, right? Anyways, fast forward a little bit, Mark essentially makes the website in the next 2 to 3 weeks. He sends it around campus. Everyone at Harvard joins within a week. He starts going from school to school to school. More and more people are joining. And then it hits Stanford, and that's where Sean Parker comes into the story. He's the Justin Timberlake character, the cool kid of Silicon Valley. Always wears Armani, except for he's got an EpiPen in his pocket because he's allergic to everything. Sean sees this idea and thinks this is a $1 billion idea. Goes and meets with Mark and Eduardo. Eduardo doesn't like him at all. He thinks he's a snake oil salesman. Now, Sean is the guy who, when he was in high school, started the company Napster with his friend Sean Fanning. That got sued out of business. Then he started a company called Plaxo, which he was the CEO of, until he got caught with cocaine at a party. And then he became the first president of Facebook until he got caught with cocaine at a party. But anyways, he sees this idea. He thinks they're great. Eduardo thinks he's a snake oil salesman. And he basically gives them the good idea to drop the from the Facebook, and it becomes Facebook. Now, Mark moves out to California. He and Sean link up, and Eduardo stays behind to finish Harvard. While they're in California, Eduardo starts to realize that they're pushing him out of the company. So he actually freezes all of the bank accounts. This upsets Sean Parker, who brings Mark into Peter Thiel's office. Peter Thiel is the billionaire that we hear more about today. He was the first person to look at Facebook in Silicon Valley and say, I think this is a good idea. And he invested $500,000. One of the best investments in the history of the world, again. But he says, why do you have this kid on your masthead named Eduardo who's not here in California? You need to get rid of him. So they fly Eduardo out to California. He walks into a room full of lawyers. He thinks they're his lawyers. They're Facebook's lawyers. They hand him a document which dilutes him to zero. The Winklevi, who are off rowing in Henley, realize that Facebook is exploding and they're not a part of it, so they sue. Eduardo, back in Boston, realizing he's been diluted to zero, sues. And that's where I came into the picture. Eduardo had come to me because he was in the midst of this lawsuit, couldn't get Mark to settle, and he figured if he talked to a writer who had a big book, he could force them to settle. He did not, and I didn't know this at the time, want me to write a book. He just wanted to tell me a story to trick Zuckerberg into settling with him. I thought this was a great book idea. I wrote a 10-page book proposal. I called it Face Off. Horrible title. There's already a John Travolta movie called Face Off. Anyways, I sent it to my agent. My agent sent it to a couple publishers, and it leaked onto the internet. It was on Gawker's website. Remember Gawker? They published my whole book proposal. I'd never seen that before. That day, a bunch of crazy things happened. Facebook settled with Eduardo for $9 billion. Yeah, good for Eduardo, right? The top of the settlement agreement says, you may never speak to Ben Mezrich again, because they thought they could stop the book from happening. And now, I didn't know this, but suddenly I got a legal restraining order from Eduardo saying I'm never allowed to contact him again. He broke up with his girlfriend because it was my wife's best friend, and he moved to Singapore, never to be heard from again. Now, to be fair, for $9 billion, none of you would ever speak to me again. I've talked to my brother, and he said, $9 billion, Ben. I think my wife would have to think carefully. $9 billion is a lot of money. So I don't begrudge him the fact that he never spoke to me again. The same day, I get a phone call out of the blue from the writer Aaron Sorkin, greatest screenwriter of our time. And he says, I want to write this as my next movie. I get a call from David Fincher, greatest director of all time. And he says, I want to direct this as my next movie. This is the most incredible news you've ever heard as a writer, except I hadn't written a book. All I had was a 10-page book proposal, right? So I'm like, crap. So I locked myself in a hotel room at the Westin Hotel in Boston, and I wrote the book in 11 weeks. Sorkin came out for the last 3 weeks, and he wrote the screenplay in those 3 weeks. So we were sitting in a hotel room, I'm handing him chapters, he's writing the screenplay. The movie was in production in 2 months, and we had a movie before I had a book. Wild, right? So this changed my entire view of the world. I suddenly realized that my books, in many ways, were really platforms for a bigger way to tell the story. And I started to shift gears, and I decided I would become a writer who writes books that become movies. That is my thing. And so essentially, I created this sort of factory approach to how I would look at my books from then on. I started getting calls from Hollywood people, producers, directors, actors. Anyone who had an idea would pitch me an idea, and I would decide whether it was something I would try and do. I would write a proposal. If I sell the movie, I write the book. If I don't sell the movie, I don't write the book. Now, I know a lot of you writers, there's a lot of literary writers you probably heard from. Some of them are a bit disturbed by this process. But what it's allowed me to do is to tell very, very big stories in a way that reaches a larger audience, or at least has the potential of reaching a larger audience, than it would be if I just sat down to write a book and then attempted to sell the movie. And so this has become my process. And so the next project that came up was something that was very, very interesting. I started to get calls from Hollywood directors, actors, like I said, and I get a call in the middle of the night from a director. And this director is a guy who is always pitching me very dangerous stories. He would pitch me, I got these gun runners in Miami, I want to embed you with them. And I was like, well, how dangerous is that? And he goes, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 9. I'm like, I don't want to do a 9, I want to do like a 3. I'll go to Vegas, embed me in Vegas. But he calls me up and he's got a story for you. You got to go to London tomorrow. And I was like, go to London tomorrow? Well, what's the story? And he goes, I can't tell you. I was like, why not? Because if I tell you, you won't do it. I was like, well, that's not a great pitch, man. But anyways, I flew to London the next day because I was desperate for another story. And this was after the Facebook social network. So I fly to London, and he invites me to this hotel. I go over to this hotel, and as I get there, outside are all these armored limos, security people, people with earpieces. And I'm like, oh, this doesn't look good. And I go in, and sitting at the bar is one of the biggest Russian oligarchs in the world. You would know who he is. Many, many, many billions of dollars. Very, very scary individual. And I walk up to the bar, and he starts to tell me this crazy story. And the story was essentially how all of the oligarchs put Putin into power. This guy and Boris Berezovsky and Roman Abramovich were these two oligarchs. And this was during the term right before Putin, where Boris Yeltsin was getting sick. He was no longer able to be president. So the oligarchs who owned all of Russia's essentially materials and all of their money wanted to put someone in power that they could control. So Boris Berezovsky was a car dealer, and he basically found a guy in the middle of St. Petersburg who had helped him set up a car dealership. It was the assistant to the mayor of St. Petersburg, who also happened to be a low-level KGB agent. That guy's name was Vladimir Putin. They took Putin, they moved him to Moscow, they made him president. The first thing he did was invite all of the oligarchs to Stalin's old house. This is a place where they used to line people up and shoot them. There's still bullet holes in all of the walls. He sat the oligarchs down at a table, and he said, you've all made a lot of money, you've all done very well. From here on out, you stay out of my way. And any oligarch who stayed out of his way is still an oligarch today. Any oligarch who didn't stay out of his way fell out of a helicopter, fell down an elevator shaft. Boris Berezovsky, who I was writing about, was found hanging in his bathroom from a scarf that Abramovich had purchased at the Hermes store in Paris. So they tell me this story, Romans people and Roman, and I immediately think, holy crap, I can't write this story. I'm going to get killed. But the thing is, they wanted to tell this story. That's what was really weird about it. So this became my book, Once Upon a Time in Russia. Writing this story was the most terrifying thing I've ever done, and I would never do it again. I used to have meetings with these guys who were so scary. One time I was at a meeting, and suddenly this very large Russian came up behind me and just shoved something into my back pocket. And I was like, what is that? And he goes, don't look, don't look. So I walk out of the party, and I think, oh, I'm going to die now, right? Polonium poisoning. I go back to the hotel room, I pull it out, and it was a computer key card. I have no idea what's on it. So I call back home in Boston, and I have a lawyer waiting for me at the airport, because I don't know if what I have is even legal. I fly back to Boston. It ended up being 1,000 pages of depositions with Putin himself about a string of murders that had occurred that obviously someone wanted me to have. So this whole writing of this book took place like that. I remember there was one scene in the book where Boris Berezovsky and Abramovich, they want to buy an oil refinery in Siberia. So they fly out to Siberia, and they meet with the guy who owns it. And they basically say, we want to buy this from you. And he laughs at them. He laughs them out of the room. They go back to Moscow. That night, that guy goes swimming in the Irkutsk River and drowns. His bodyguard, who's the only witness to the event, gets into a bar fight and dies. So I write this chapter, and I call up the oligarch, and I go, you know, this makes it seem like you had this man killed. And he pauses, and he goes, yes, it seems that way. And I say, well, you know, the integrity I have as a writer, I say, do you want me to change this? And he says, no, it's fine. And I was like, well, how is this fine? And he goes, when you think about Russia in the 1990s, don't think about America in the 1990s. Think about America in the 1890s. In the 1890s, if a fellow businessman disrespected you, you had him killed. And that's the whole matter-of-fact way they approached the way they did business at the time. And so that's essentially the character of that book. It's very intense. It's very rough. I recommend you find it if you can. It's actually very hard to find. But it was a book called Once Upon a Time in Russia, and that was the beginning of this process where I sell movies based on the thing. It hasn't been made yet, but it's been set up as a big show on Netflix. And so we get to the last project of mine right before Mistress and the Key, which was the GameStop story. I don't know if any of you followed what happened with GameStop and Roaring Kitty or saw the movie Dumb Money, but I was sitting at home in the middle of the COVID. It was the horrible moment of COVID where we're all just staring at computers because there's nothing else to do. And I started to see this stock just go crazy, a stupid stock. GameStop, you know, I loved GameStop as a kid, but it's this store that really shouldn't exist anymore, right? There's 500 of them. They're in malls during a pandemic that nobody goes to. They sell game controllers and hard games at a time when we're all digitally downloading things. There's no reason for it to exist. But for some reason, this guy in his basement in Boston who wore a bandana around his head and had pictures of cats behind him fell in love with this stock. And he started live streaming 9 hours a day. Just live streaming, talking about GameStop. And the stock went from $2 to $5 to $50. Then a whole bunch of people on Reddit who were stuck at home during the pandemic, mostly college kids, were like, hey, I like this stock. And they started to throw money in it. And it went from $50 to $100 to $500. It was suddenly the most valuable company in the world. GameStop, this crappy thing that sells video games, was worth more than GE. The reason it got so high was there was this hedge fund run by this guy named Gabe Kaplan, who was a regular guy, done everything right in his life, had gone to the right schools, had shorted GameStop. Perfectly good move to short GameStop. And essentially by doing that, he enraged the Reddit crowd who decided they were going to break him. And essentially, they destroyed his $11 billion company, went to zero, and GameStop went all the way to 500, and that's when Robinhood, which is how you buy GameStop, stopped the buy button. They took away the way to buy it, and the stock crashed. So it was this crazy story. I saw it happening live, and I thought, this is a great story. I started getting calls from my agents, and they were like, this looks like one of your stories. And I said, well, can I write it? And I started to look around. Do I have a connection to the Roaring Kitty guy, as he called himself? Do I have a connection to the billionaire? I realized I did. I wrote an 8-page book proposal. I sent it out. 2 days later, we had 9 studios bidding on it. We sold it to Sony Pictures, and then I sold the book. I wrote the book in the next 2 months, and it was Dumb Money came out a year later. And so that has become my process, which leads us to today in Mistress and the Key, which is essentially a Da Vinci Code style thriller, takes place in Boston. I'm going back to my fiction roots, using what I've learned in writing nonfiction to attempt to write a really true feeling thriller about very bizarre events that took place during the revolution that ties into normal times. And the way that book came about was essentially during the pandemic, I got a call from the Boston Globe, and they said, all the news is dark and sad. We want to publish something happy. Will you do something serialized? Something a day, every day for 20 days. And I said, I'll do it only if I can write a thriller. And they said, sure. So I wrote the book, a chapter a day for 21 days. I wrote the book in 21 days. I had to start writing in the morning and hand it in by 4 in the afternoon. And what happened was I just started getting calls because the audience grew and grew and grew to the point where we had 250,000 readers a week. And then Steven Spielberg bought it to turn it into a movie, so I turned it into a book, Mistress and the Key. I think it's a pretty cool story. Midnight Ride and Mistress and the Key are the 2 books. It's broken into 2 books. I'll be writing a 3rd one as well, so if you enjoy it, hopefully there'll be another one in a few weeks, no, in a few years, but I'm writing as fast as I can. And I guess that leads us to sort of my final part of my story, which is a lot of accidents have happened to get me here, but I've always kind of felt that the most important thing to me is to tell the story in as big a way as possible to as many people who are willing to sort of hear it or read it or see it or whatever. I don't care how people consume it, but I really, really love the fact that they have something physical that goes along with the movie. And that leads me to today, and I hope I hear lots of questions about all of my different stuff or anything you want to hear about my style, because I know it's a little absurd. And that leads me today. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. I hope I left a good time. I don't know what.
No, the timing was perfect.
Thank you so much.
Ben.
Yes.
We have time for questions now. So for those for our volunteers in the audience, if you get your microphones, you're all positioned and ready to go. But I'm going to take an opportunity to ask the very first question. Given your association with the MIT blackjack team, what should I do about my Super Bowl bet?
Oh, your Super Bowl bet. It's a great question. I mean, I have to say, I think that Taylor Swift is going to win the Super Bowl tonight. I don't know. I mean, I'm from the New England area, so I probably feel like I have to say Philadelphia, but I don't know if I really I mean, we'll see what happens. I think it'll be fun either way. Luckily, being a Patriots fan, I don't have to really, make a bet this time.
All right, that didn't help me much with my bet. All right, first questions.
Ben, you're the world's expert on social media. Did Twitter being bought by Elon Musk cause Facebook to drop content moderation from its program?
Yeah, it's 100%. I think, so I wrote a book called Breaking Twitter, which we have here as well, which is the story of Elon's takeover of Twitter. It's a bit of a controversial story and book, because of the moment we're in and the way the country is in some ways. But to answer your specific question, I do think what Elon has done at Twitter, one of the interesting things I think that you could say in a very positive light was the idea of having the community monitor the content. It can go one way or the other, but it was an interesting thing. I think that Zuckerberg's transformation over the last year is fascinating, which is why we may end up making a sequel to The Social Network, although Jesse Eisenberg's going to have to work out a lot to look like the new Zuckerberg, right? And Zuckerberg is real cool now with the hair and the necklaces and the ultimate fighting, but I do... Yeah, he's not the nerd anymore. He could take on a Winklevi, right? But I think that they are taking away content monitoring because of what Elon has done. Everyone will feel differently about that. I personally am terrified by what's going on, but I think that there are different opinions about it. If you read my book, Breaking Twitter, you will go down a rabbit hole of how Elon got to who he is today. Because if you just read Walter Isaacson's book, you do not know Elon. You need to read my book, and then you'll know Elon, and you'll be a little scared. But okay. Don't want to get political, but you'll be a little scared. Yes.
The way that you have flipped the model on this is amazing, and thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you.
If you were to give advice to any writers in the room who are published, who would want to follow in your footsteps,
Yes.
what would you say?
First of all, I think you should ask my wife whether you really want to follow in my footsteps, because I'm a bit crazy. I will say that we are in a moment in time where I love books, but the book business is having a difficult time. It's very hard to sell books. When I started out in the 90s, you could sell 1 million books, right? Now you can't sell 1 million books. It's very, very hard to do. But 1 million people will watch the crappiest show on Netflix, right? We're in a moment where we are consuming massive amounts of material and stories, but we're just not consuming it the way we used to consume it. We are watching streaming continuously. And we're still watching movies at home. We're watching television in short pieces, and we're watching YouTube. So there's never been a better time to create content. We are in a golden age of stories. We all consume so many stories every day. Think of how much you've watched in the last week. It's amazing. And so I think as a writer, I'm very excited by that. But you got to pivot. And I think if you're a writer today, you really should be having your eye on how do I present myself to Hollywood as it is now. Not as it was in the 90s, but as it is now. What is Netflix doing? What is Amazon doing? Where are my kids? What are they watching? And you have to create a brand for yourself. It's more important than ever to be a brand than it was before. Because anyone now can publish a book. There are 1 million books, right? But not everyone can be James Patterson or Michael Crichton or whatever it is you want to be. And so you have to figure out a way to create what it is you do. I know this sounds very commercial, and I really believe if you're a literary person and you're sitting at home and writing the great literary novel, you should definitely do that. But if you want to make a living at writing, you have to figure out how do I write in a way that 1 million people are going to read it or see it or watch it or hear it. And so I think you have to have your eyes on that a little bit more. Thank you. Yeah.
I had a question. I'm one of those people who actually know you first by your movies, and I love Dumb Money. I have a question that I think you are very unique, and that really comes out in that movie, and even the movie about the MIT blackjack players, of getting into the technical sort of how the sausage is made.
Yes.
You weren't too kind to Ken Griffith and to some of the traders.
Oh, yeah.
And
They don't like me very much.
But how do and not many literary people can figure out like how they were making money behind the scenes on these trades and whatnot. How do you do it? Are you a literature major and a math major?
I'm not an
and
any
that really
major.
Makes you
yeah.
very relevant today.
Thank you. Yes. So I'm a dilettante. I'm not a knowledgeable person about anything deeply, but about a lot of things on a shallow level. In general, my brothers call me like a Muppet. I kind of Muppet my way through life. I'm very, very good at research. I can find anyone, anywhere, instantly and talk to them. I'm really good at researching online and social media and things like that. And I am a layman, and if I can understand it, I feel like my audience can understand it. So when I write a book about the financial world or about biotechnology or whatever, I try to become as much of an expert as I can by talking to people in the field. And then I try to make it in a way that I or my 9th grade son could understand it. It's tricky. It is tricky sometimes because some of this stuff is just so, my whole goal is never to have your eyes glaze over. I remember when I wrote a book about Bitcoin and the word blockchain, I hate that word. It makes my eyes glaze over. It's the worst word ever invented. How do you explain blockchain to people without making them throw up, right? And that's how I approach anything. Like, how do I explain short selling without making you throw up? Like, I don't want my audience to throw up. So I find a way to tell it in a way that's fun, dramatic, interesting, maybe a little cliched. It's like that moment in that movie where, the person starts talking to the camera and it's really funny when they put Margot Robbie in the bathtub and in the Wall Street movie or whatever it was. Because you wanna tell the hard stuff, but you want to tell it in a way that it doesn't seem like medicine. And I think that is just a skill of mine, but I've developed it over years. You have to know the subject really, really well, but then you have to tell it in a way that an 8th or 9th grader could understand it. But yeah, thank you.
What does your father think of
My
your
my
mom.
father. Yeah. Well, I will say that
Process.
my mom is still hoping I go to medical school, do something with my life. But I will say no. My parents have been incredibly supportive. It was interesting. So when I first started out, they were like, "You're never going to make a living. What are you going to do for a living?" And then as I started to have success, and like they started getting interviewed sometimes, they were like, "Okay, maybe this is working out." And then when they hear my speech, they get all nervous again because they're like, "You were how much in debt?" Yeah, I think that they're very proud and happy and really excited that I did something. There's no one in our family had ever done anything in the arts. It's a very medical, everyone in both my brothers are doctors. You know, my wife has a dental degree. My brother's wives are doctors, and my mom's a lawyer. Everyone is a doctor or a lawyer. Generations. I'm the only one who went and became the black sheep of the family to do something differently. But they're very proud that I think my crazy work ethic, where I can write 40 pages a day, comes entirely from my dad and his ability to sort of focus in a way that's just completely insane. And so, yes, they're proud, very proud, but still a little nervous, which I think they should be. Yes?
Are you still friendly with any of the Russian oligarchs, or are any of them still alive?
Yeah, friendly. Oh, I got a story. I was in New York with one of these guys, and this is a guy who has hands like anvils. This is a guy who has wielded a baseball bat in fights before. And I'm walking in New York with him, you know, to have dinner with him. And behind us are a couple of NYU students, and they're loud and they're having a great time. It's a fun night in New York. It's Friday night. And he's like, "I'm getting very annoyed at these people behind us." And I'm like, "Well, it's okay." And he's like, "It's very loud and annoying." And I'm like, "It's New York. It's fun." He goes, "Shall I do something?" And there was this moment where his eyes rolled back like Jaws, where you only see the whites of his eyes. And I was like, "Holy crap, he's going to kill these kids." And I was like, no, we're just going to have dinner. We're having a nice night. And he's like, "Okay." And so friend is a strong word. I wouldn't say I'm friends. I do stay in touch now and again. The Ukraine thing, kind of, they all had to run. They lost their boats and their houses and their football teams, soccer teams, and they're all kind of hiding. But every now and then I reach out if I have a question about something in particular. So yeah, I've stayed close to, I've got a Rolodex of billionaires. I think it was Janet Maslin at the Times who called me the billionaire's best friend, because I always make them look good, and that's why they come to me. I'm not trying to neg anybody, even though Zuckerberg kind of hates me and Elon kind of hates me, and I guess they all kind of hate me. I try not to I'm not trying to reveal anything that they aren't revealing. I'm trying to tell their story from their point of view. And everyone thinks of themselves as the star of their own movie, right? No one thinks I'm the villain. Everyone thinks I'm the hero. And so that's how I try and present them from their point of view. They're just not always the hero. But thank you, yes. I'm friendly with still a few, yes. Yes.
Hi. Thanks for a great talk and coming to our beautiful town of Savannah.
Beautiful. Yes.
So you don't write the screenplay?
No. Well.
And why? It doesn't sound like you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I have written a bunch of screenplays, and I wrote for the show Billions and did an episode 3, season 5, if you saw that. Thank you. But here's the thing. Hollywood doesn't want the author of the book to write the screenplay. I can write the screenplay, but to make a movie, here's some inside scoop, some alpha for you writers out there, you need 3 things. You need an A-list screenwriter, an A-list star, and an A-list director. If you're missing any one of those 3 elements, you ain't gonna get a movie made. And that's what's really, really hard about the business. If I push myself forward and say, I'm gonna write the screenplay, they'll say, sure, write the screenplay, and then they'll take my screenplay, and then they'll hire a screenwriter. And that's what they do. Unless you reach the level of, say, 50 Shades of Grey, you can't force them to use your screenplay, only to let you write it. So you get a little money, but it pushes the movie back another 6 months. So my goal is to get the movie made. How do we get the movie made? I got to get a Sorkin or the guy who wrote the last Fantastic Four movie, whoever the hell it is. I got to get an A-list screenwriter, I got to get Tom Cruise, and I got to get Fincher. And then you got a movie. And so for me, my perspective, I love writing books. I'm not, a screenwriter. I know how to do it, but I'm not a successful screenwriter. So why push it back 6 months just to force my way in there? So I have written some spec scripts. Maybe at some point I will get them going, and then I will be an A-list screenwriter, and I can push myself into that position. But right now, I'm being very strategic, because we're in a society and a system right now moving very quickly. You need to pivot. If you're a writer, think of yourself as a small internet company. You're a small internet company trying to survive the strangest time. How do you survive? You pivot, you pivot, you pivot. Yesterday you sold pet food. Tomorrow you're going to sell video games, whatever. But you got to figure out what are people trying to do right now. Hollywood right now is in a weird place. You need an A-list screenwriter, an A-list star, and a director. And that's what your goal should be. So yes, I could write screenplays. I have written a few, but I don't do it on my movies for the most part.
Ben, we have time for 2 more
Sure.
questions.
Hi, Ben.
Yeah.
Right over here.
Oh, I can't see.
I'm curious because it seems like you really nailed finding the right story or a story that can be compelling. What are the elements you meet a lot of people? I know you're doing the legwork of being somewhere where interesting stories are coming to you.
Yes.
But what is it when you hear it that is an interesting person or that's a story I want to tell?
Great question. What am I looking for? And everyone pitches me stories. I get pitched stories. Every time you see something in the news, I get a call. Often from prison, but I get a call. I remember when those Thai kids were stuck in that cave. The minute they were out of the cave, the 13 Thai kids called me through their manager, and I didn't want to write that story. I didn't think it was going to be that known for that long. Remember Charlie Sheen called me back in his troubles? And my wife was like, "You're not going to hang out with Charlie Sheen for a year," so that kind of was nixed. I'm looking for stories that have a lot of really smart people, not criminals, but super smart people who are bucking authority, who are taking on the casino or the house or the government, doing something really interesting, but it has to be something that is the origin of something that's going to last, like something huge. Facebook I knew was going to change the world, right? I feel like every time I'm looking for a story that's going to change the world, but I can tell it in a small, dramatic way. A Shakespearean drama that I also know 5 years from now will be really important. Breaking Twitter, I think, will be one of the most important books I've ever written for a lot of reasons. And I knew it at the time. I feel like my GameStop story, Dumb Money, it was a fun comedy, but I think what happened turned the market into a casino that is going to continue forward and change all of our lives going forward. I'm always looking for what Michael Crichton did so well, was he picked a moment that was going to be important a year from now. That's super hard to do. And he always wanted to be Jurassic Park. I want big dinosaurs eating cities, right? I want something that everyone in the world will want to read or see. And that's always, I get pitch stories all the time that are beautiful stories, and I say, it's not really what I do. There are so many beautiful stories out there, you should write it. But if you want to tell the next Jurassic Park, that's where I want to come in. I want it to be something that they call it the elevator pitch. It has to be one perfect sentence. 6 MIT kids who took Vegas for millions. It's perfect, right? The kid who started Facebook because he couldn't meet girls, right? Perfect. You need the perfect sentence that you can get into an elevator. By the time you get out of the elevator, everyone in the elevator wants to read it. That's what I'm looking for every time.
Okay, one last question.
So you kind of touched on this, but as a Chelsea fan who has found the last few years horrible, did they do the right thing in kicking Abramovich out?
Did they do the right thing by kicking Abramovich out, you asked? You mean morally or for the team? You know, in all honesty, the Russian oligarch thing is very tricky. When the Ukraine war started, I talked to a lot of oligarchs, and every single one of them hated it. They didn't like the war in Ukraine. It did nothing good for them. They all tried to talk Putin out of it. And Abramovich especially, he got poisoned. I don't know if you heard that story. He set up a meeting to try and make peace and came out of it poisoned and almost died. So the oligarchs had nothing to gain from that war, but the only way we could get at Putin was by taking all the oligarchs' money. Now, let's be fair. These are very bad men, okay? They have murdered a lot of people. They stole most of their money. So should they have ever had their money in the first place? Who knows? But I think that they were everyone thought the oligarchs can make Putin bow to their will. The reality is Putin makes the oligarchs bow to their will. The oligarchs are his cash register, nothing more. So it wasn't like they could control Putin. But for Chelsea, I don't know. Is it good for oligarchs to own soccer teams? I don't know. That's a much bigger question, I think. But yeah, good luck. Good luck. Good luck. Yep.
Ben, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.
That was terrific. All right, but we have something special for you. Yes, we have something special for you.
Well, I have to say,
go ahead. No,
it's
go.
on.
Yes.
You guys are all wonderful. This has just been the most incredible book festival. What you guys do down here, I've been to 1 million book festivals. It is hard to pull off what you guys do.
Yes.
It is beautiful. Thank you.
just a token of our appreciation, here is a copy of cartoons by our very own Flannery O'Connor. Yes, absolutely. Ben will be signing books down here in front. Make sure that you have your signing card. Thank you all for being here.